Back at one of my very first jobs in IT, there was this guy named Gary. And Gary was one of your prototypical goateed network engineer people. And he was a brilliant guy, brilliant network engineer. Gary was also the keeper of the spreadsheet. And when it came time to actually get an IP address for a server that you needed to install somewhere in the data center, part of the job of getting that server up and operational was going to talk to Gary, because as keeper of the spreadsheet, it was his job to let you know what IP address on the server net you could actually have. Well, that's been a long time ago, and strangely enough, in a lot of organizations, the person whose job it is to keep the spreadsheet is still a role that you find in a lot of organizations. Thankfully, there are newer technologies these days that can greatly automate the process of managing the IP addresses in your environment. Windows now supports it. It supported it with Windows Server 2012 RTM, and we get a just newer, fresher version here in R2. It also is now important enough for Microsoft to include it here as part of the MCSA exam. Now, IPAM is more than just a spreadsheet. In fact, if I just show you, this is even the spreadsheet that I'm using here for this environment, my little spreadsheet of all the host names and IP addresses that I plan on using. So even today, we're still using spreadsheets in order to manage these static addresses. But the idea behind IPAM is to help you get away from that static management of addresses and to turn that into a much more automated experience. With an IPAM server in place, you can have your server go about interrogating the different machines in the environment and managing the spreadsheet on your behalf. Now, one of the things that a lot of people probably aren't aware about IPAM is that IPAM can also, if you start getting a little bit deeper into the world of virtualization, even help you out with some of your virtual environments as well. There is a hook. There's a hook in between Virtual Machine Manager and IPAM to have IPAM manage your IP address ranges in VMM. So we're starting to see solutions like IP address management as just an awesome thing that you can implement to help you just deal with the overwhelming number of IP addresses that are out there. In this nugget, we're going to go through the process of deploying IPAM, the whole getting it installed and getting it ready to manage those IP addresses. There are a couple of different ways in which we can actually get IPAM up and operational. Once we get it installed onto our IPAM server, well, we can then deploy out the client reconfigurations either through group policy or manually. And as you'll find out here in a second, I hope that you have the ability to deploy these through group policy, because the sheer number of adjustments to each and every server in your environment that IPAM requires is a bit overwhelming. And having a couple of really nice pre-generated group policies that'll just do all the work for you is a whole lot easier than having to do it manually. And I'll show you how to accomplish both of these here in this nugget. An IPAM server obviously needs a database, and we can choose either a Windows internal database or we can choose a SQL Server database in order to do this. If you have the usual standard database rules apply here. Smaller environments are just great with a Windows internal database. Those that are larger may need SQL. Windows internal database comes with all the caveats as far as backing up and being able to access it and all the stuff that you just associate with not having a full SQL database. We will, once our IPAM server is up and operational, then go through the process of discovering the servers on this net and then creating and managing the different blocks of IP address, blocks and ranges of IP addresses that are out there. We have a 1 net, we have a 2 net, we have a 3 net of different servers. And so we want to be able to manage the different equipment that exists in those environments, both DHCP equipment and and statically associated IP addresses. We'll monitor the utilization of the address space so that we can get alerts whenever we're about to run out of addresses. And then we'll talk about a couple of the minor tasks here. Migrating. There's one command here that you can use to upgrade your Windows internal database to a SQL database if you need to know that. The usual delegation of administration, and then just a review of the different PowerShell commands that IPAM exposes so that you can do all the work that you're used to doing with your spreadsheet, but now enhanced with the power of PowerShell. So, all right, let's just talk about all these neat things that we can do here with IPAM. Let's go back here, and there's my spreadsheet, all the different ridiculous addresses. I am so tired of managing these IP address spreadsheets because, if your spreadsheet is like mine, invariably something, just the world happens, and the contents of the spreadsheet, for some reason, don't exactly mirror the real configuration of the environment. I got to tell you, my old buddy Gary was much better at managing that spreadsheet because he was insistent about making sure that you talk to him as part of any server deployment. If I want to install IPAM, I just need first to go here to the Add Roles and Features wizard, and I'm going to install all the components here and prerequisites associated with it. I am showing you this only because I want you to be aware that this installation also installs the Windows internal database. So we're going to run this. I'm not going to go through a SQL installation. We're going to go through and install this onto Windows internal database, and then I'll show you here in a minute what the PowerShell command is if you ever want to upscale it to a regular SQL database at some point in the future. The other thing I want to tell you too here is that here for under the feature administration tools is that IPAM has its own Windows client that you can install onto other machines as well. Now, in order to use that client, you have to get the client downloaded and installed onto the local machine, and then go through the usual process of adding your IPAM server to the list of managed servers here inside of Server Manager. Okay, that's the only thing really that you got to be aware of here is that there's a separate client and a server, and that we're using the Windows internal database. So let me go ahead and actually install all the bits here, and when we come back, we'll have an installed IPAM server, and we'll take a look at the initial configuration. And we're back. So as you can see, we've completed here this installation of IPAM, and we've got this nifty little Server Manager console here. And it tells us that we have 6 different steps that are required to get our IPAM server from merely installed to installed and gathering data from the different servers in our environment. We've completed step 1. We've connected here to our server file1.company.pri. And now the second step in the process is to go about actually provisioning IPAM's services. Now, the cool part about IPAM is that unlike the manual spreadsheet, like my friend Gary's, the IPAM server, its job is to go out and talk to the different network services out in your environment, gather relevant data, and then use that data to populate a visualization, a view of the different IP addresses and how they're used in that environment. So this involves hooking up to things like DHCP, DNS, network policy server potentially for VPN clients, and even Active Directory so that you can gather that data. You think about it, each one of these different network services has a different view of the data, and so hooking up into all of them will, with a little bit of logic over the top, allow this server to provide the information that it requires. I mentioned that we've got a couple of different options here for the database. The first option here is our Windows internal database. Perfectly acceptable solution for most situations, except in the case where you want to have the extra added features that Microsoft SQL Server provides. Clustering, failover, easy backups, the abilities to dig directly into the database, those sorts of things. But for most situations, again, we're really just kind of populating a slightly more intelligent spreadsheet here. So for most situations, using a Windows internal database is probably going to work for a lot of us. And even just the default location for that database is probably a great solution. If you do decide to go Windows internal database and then later on need to make the change so that instead you go via a SQL server, well, don't sweat it, because there is, as I said before, a single PowerShell command that will allow you to make that change very seamlessly. Now, it's here in this next step where we have a very important decision that we have to make. So we've installed IPAM, and we're going through this process now of the provisioning for IPAM. And we have a one-time decision that we have to make that once we make, we can't change. The only way you can change this provisioning method after installation is by reinstalling IPAM. These two methods are, as you can see here, the first being the manual way, and the second being via group policy. Now, the group policy based, if you have the ability to use group policy, is absolutely the better solution here. And it's mainly because there are an incredible amount of configurations that are required at each of these individual network services to get them up and operational. If, however, you don't have group policy available to you, you still can accomplish the task. You've just got to go to each and every server in order to do that. And there's a lot of steps. I'll show you what these steps are here in just a second. If you end up choosing group policy, well, then one thing you'll need to plug in here is a GPO name prefix, because when you choose this option, we're going to use a command, a PowerShell command, this invoke IPAM GPO processing, in order to actually generate a set of group policy objects that'll automatically provision all the necessary bits to the servers in your environment. So if you can do this, it's awesome, because it greatly automates this whole process. Now, if you can't, if this is something where it's just not available to you, your Active Directory team doesn't really like it when the server team is managing group policy, or one of the other million ridiculous reasons that people are not allowed to use group policy these days, I got to tell you, I hear it all the time. We're not allowed to use group policy. I don't understand. Well, in those environments, there is a way to manually configure those managed server access settings. And there are actually 3 different approaches depending on what the type of server is going to be. So if you're a DHCP, DNS, or a DC or NPS server, you're going to accomplish a couple of different things. I'm pointing you here to the Microsoft website just in case these things happen to evolve over time. But really, let me step through the high-level steps that are required in order to do each of these services manually. The first step is ensuring that your firewall settings are correct so that you can actually access the server, that is DHCP. So here are the variety of firewall rules and security groups and what have you that are necessary in order to make that happen. You also need to configure a security group on that DHCP server. The IPAM server needs to be so that the server itself, the IPAM server object, must be a member of the domain IPAM users group, and also a member of the local, on that local DHCP server, the DHCP users and event log readers security groups. Okay? Then restart the DHCP service in order for those changes to become active. So got to have those on that local DHCP server for this to work. You then need to configure a DHCP audit share that points to Windows System 32 DHCP and restart the server service again. Okay, so do this on every single DHCP server in your environment. DNS has some similar requirements, although one of them is just really off the wall crazy. For DHCP to work, there's a couple of firewall rules here, also a security group. We need to make some changes here to our event log access as well. I'll show you how wild this is here in a second. As before, the IPAM server needs to be a member of that IPAM users group, and it also must be a member of the event log readers security group. This security group can be a little bit different depending on whether your machine is a domain controller or not. It just has to do with where security groups end up lying on domain controllers as opposed to member servers. So as you can see down here, there are different instructions for whether you're going to configure the security group on a member server or a DC DNS server or a member DNS server. We're just talking domain local groups here primarily. Then we need to set up event log monitoring, which is configured by setting this registry key. We actually have to hack the registry for this to function. And the hack is a little wild here. This is one of the more wild hacks I've seen in my history. So the way that you hack this thing is to find, first of all, the registry key that you're intending on going to. And then when you double-click the custom SD key, that custom SD key has this long set of CIDL information here for providing the access that's required for you to be able to access your DNS server. And what you need to do, this is wild, is to position I love this, position the mouse cursor at the end of the string over here. Then open up a Windows PowerShell prompt and use getAdComputer. This is the getAdComputer commandlets are typically installed on domain controllers, so you may need to remote the domain controller or install the module or what have you. And then look up the name of the IPAM server and find the SID information down here. Like I said, this gets wild. That SID information is what you're going to end up populating with this additional information down here at the bottom, a semicolon OX1 blah 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 blah, to create this value. So a surprisingly complex series of steps that's required, and absolutely a reason why to use the group policy stuff, because you can definitely screw this up, especially when you think about the fact that you have to do this for every single DNS server out there. Oh my goodness. So when you're done with that, then click OK to close the registry editor. That's the big change right there. When you're done with that, then make sure that you add the IPAM server to the DNS admins security group right there. This is the case if the server is also a domain controller. But if your DNS server is not a domain controller, well then you're going to need to add the computer account of the IPAM server to the local administrators group on the DNS server. All right? Even Microsoft doesn't recommend this due to security concerns, but it's something that you have to accomplish. So that's the step for DNS. Last over here are the steps for your domain controllers and your network policy servers, a firewall rule, a security group, event log readers, very important here, And I believe that's it for this server. Yeah. So all these steps are necessary in order for you to use the manual method. For those of us that can use group policy, the group policy based process starts by entering then this GPO name prefix. So let me plug in here IPAM GPO as my GPO name prefix. And this will essentially go about creating all the necessary bits in a group policy object that I can just deploy this thing out. Choose the next button, and you'll see that we're creating these three here GPOs in our group policy management console. One each for DHCP, DNS, and for DC and NPS. Now, these things, in addition to being created as part of this wizard, there's also another step that's required as well, and that's the invoke IPAM GPO processing commandlet. So let's go through that next step here, just so that we've got everything in group policy to begin getting our servers configured. I'm going to come down here and run Windows PowerShell, and I would like actually to run Windows PowerShell via an administrator. There we go. So we're going to run Windows PowerShell, and then invoke IPAM GPO processing. And then we've got a couple of parameters to add in here. So domain is going to be company.pri, and GPO prefix name will be IPAM GPO. And then IPAM server FQDN will in this case be file1.company.pri. Let's see if that works. This commandlet creates and links the three group policy objects in the domain, and essentially gives us all the things we need to do to get these things linked up. Let's go ahead and create those. After a second, we can see that the policies get created, and if I do gpmc.msc, we should now see that these three new group policy objects are available here in our domain, 1, 2, and 3. You may be asking at this point, well, all right, Greg, well, you're applying these group policies here to the at the domain level. Is it actually a smart idea for me? Am I going to inadvertently end up configuring these settings for every machine in my domain? That's a good question, actually, because the answer is no. There is intelligence that's built into these policies to ensure that only the machines you configured as managed machines are the ones that will actually be reconfigured by these group policy objects that you've created. So this is kind of a handy thing here, because you can go about just linking them at the GPO or at the domain level, and then rest assured that only the machines under management are going to be the ones that actually get those changes applied. The way in which we bring those under management begins here with step number 3 by configuring our server discovery. So if I can choose whatever domain I want here, company.pri, and add whatever roles that I want to discover, DCs, DHCP servers, DNS servers, and click the OK button, this will begin the process of going through identifying which, or preparing the process of identifying which servers we want to go about discovering. We can then start that server discovery. As you can see here, there's already one or more tasks that are running. We can start that server discovery to actually go about discovering the different machines that exist in the environment. This process will take a couple of minutes to complete. I can accelerate things thanks to the power of video filming, but you can see here that once we complete this process, then we have a list of discovered servers based off of some period of time. Once we're complete, we can then select the servers we want to add to manage. Notice how we have 4 servers here, our 4 domain controllers, of which included in those domain controllers are DNS and DHCP services as well. For each one, we can choose to edit the server and then set the manageability status to managed. So you'll see here what it's already discovered for each server which services are available on that machine, as well as the IP address up here. So for each of these, I'm just going to set these all to managed, and then let a period of time pass so that they can receive the group policies that's required. So let me go ahead and finish these and go about that process of accelerating group policy. I just run that GP update on all 4 machines so that each machine will have all those necessary changes configured, and then we can see what we're going to gather, the information that we'll be gathering from these 4 machines now that they've been brought under management. And we're back. So to be perfectly honest, I actually went and took lunch, and after coming back, group policy had accelerated itself. And as you can see, after group policy completes doing what it's doing, and then we cycle the server here, the IPAM server here, a couple times, we'll see that our access is now unblocked because we've processed those GPO, those group policy objects, and we're also set to manage. So these 4 servers are now the servers that we are querying for their information. So we're going to pull information out of DNS and DHCP and Active Directory for this information. And with this information, if we come back over here to our IP address space, we'll see that we have already automatically figured out that we're in a 192.168.1.0 subnet. So it's at this point that we have to go through the process of actually migrating the content that we already have into IPAM. So if you already have a spreadsheet available, this is going to make this process very easy, because we really just need to get the list of addresses sucked into IPAM so that we can then, from that point, begin to manage the addresses from that point forward. Now, in order for us to accomplish that, we need to set up a variety of different structures for how these addresses are going to get laid out. At the top level will be a series, 1 or more IP address blocks. Now, the IP address blocks, you can think of it as the largest boundary for a variety of IP addresses. So this is the block. And inside the block will be 1 or more IP address ranges. Each one of these ranges, it's kind of easiest just to think of it as just a contiguous series of addresses, kind of like a DHCP scope. In fact, a DHCP scope will honestly be one of the main types of ranges that you end up creating. So if you, in our case, we have, 50 through 150 set up for our DHCP scope, that will be one of the IP address ranges that we'll need to set up. You can also set up ranges for static addresses as well. And in the IPAM world, these are considered IPAM managed addresses. So you can think of them as static, but because we're actually handling the assignment of them through IPAM, we think of them as an IPAM address. There are other types of address types as well, or range types as well, but the one that you really should at least be aware of, if not for this test, but just because you may make use of it if you end up implementing System Center Virtual Machine Manager, is a VMM type address range. Now, a VMM type address range is kind of cool because it is neither a DHCP range, nor is it a statically addressed range. In the VMM world, we refer to these as IP pools. And an IP pool for VMM it's actually a really kind of cool type of address, because it's an address that behaves like a static address, but is assigned dynamically like a DHCP address. And if I'm creating a bunch of servers that are sitting in a VMM environment somewhere, this kind of IP pool type address assignment is actually quite cool. The buzzword I've heard used before is IP address injection. So we're not actually using the DHCP client to assign addresses. We're actually using some mechanism, PowerShell or what have you, to directly inject the IP address into the machine. So the machine believes it to be a static address, but it's actually managed by the server infrastructure as a dynamic address. So this is one of the neatest parts about IPAM, is the ability to hook IPAM into VMM for the management of these IP pools. Without IPAM, the visibility into VMM's IP pools is a little bit limited. So these are mainly the 3 different kinds. There are others, but these are the 3 major kinds of IP address ranges that we'll be creating, or we can create here in IPAM. And then within each range will be a number of different IP addresses. Now, I told you that the process of actually getting ourselves into IPAM-based management requires a bit of a migration. And that really requires us to create these address blocks and address ranges, and then to inject or to import in the different IP addresses that we have existing in our spreadsheet. Once they're already in, then we can use them to manage the systems and deal with their DNS registration, perhaps create DHCP reservations if we need to, and then also with that information identify the next available address when somebody has a need for a new address for a new machine. The process starts by creating 1 or more IP address blocks. So let's assume that we need to create a block for our 1NET. We'll create that with the network ID of 192.168.1.0 with a prefix length of 24, so a 24-bit subnet mask. If I choose yes here, this will automatically assign the addresses 1.0 through 1.255 because of that 24-bit subnet mask. If I choose no here, then I could set it to some other series of addresses as the start and end point for the range. Now, if this happens to be an internet resolvable address, if it is, I'll need to choose whichever of the regional internet registries I end up using for, or that the series of addresses have been assigned by. So your the LAC NIC, the app NIC, the ARIN, the AFRINIC, any of those different, the IANA, any of those regional internet registries that you will use for figuring out which of these addresses you want to use. So if I pick, let me see here, I can show you what it looks like. If I pick a 19 net address, these are the different address ranges that are available to me. Obviously, because this is a 192 net address, it's a private address, and so there's really no ability for me to choose a regional internet registry because one doesn't exist for a private internet address. These are the required fields down here. The ones down here at the bottom are optional. When I create the IP address block here, that will show up in my list of IP address blocks. Now that's the first step in the process. The second step in the process is to actually create the ranges that we want to use inside of those sort of main level IP address blocks that we just created. Now there is a range that's already been created for us here. You can see that the interrogation of that DHCP server has let us know that there is indeed a range between 100 and 150. It's managed by DHCP. It's a dynamic address assignment type, and there are 51 available or assigned addresses in this DHCP scope, none of which are utilized here at this point. Now this is kind of cool here because from a single screen, I can see how utilized this particular range happens to be. This range we're seeing here is actually considered to be underutilized. And what that means is that if I come here to, let's see here, where is that at? Into the IP range, I'm using the automatic utilization calculation, which by default is set to between 20% and 80% of the addresses in the range. I could also, if I want, change this utilization calculation. I can edit the utilization calculation if I go about recreating the range. I do want to show you where you can adjust this utilization calculation if you don't like the fact that you're seeing this underutilized item here. And in order to do that, you come up here to Manage and IPAM Settings to see just some of the master settings associated with IPAM. So we won't spend much time here. This is the server discovery we already looked at. If you want to configure any custom fields to add columns to the database, field associations that associate with those columns. But the item down here, the utilization threshold, is where I can define when I want to be alerted when a range is underutilized or when a range is overutilized. Nice here because, again, if I'm not interested in seeing if something's underutilized because I don't care, or if I want to dial up the threshold for overutilization, I can accomplish that as well. We're getting the actual range information here because we've queried our DHCP server, but we also want to create for ourselves a range of addresses that we can use for static assignment as well. Let's go about doing that by going up here to Tasks and creating a separate manually assigned range in the 192.168 1.0/24 block. We don't need to create a subnet here because that's already been created for us through that discovery process. And then let's go ahead and statically assign 151 through 254 to be managed by IPAM. So this is going to be a static series of addresses. Our service instance in this case will be the IPAM server on the local host. They'll be static addresses as opposed to dynamic or virtual IP addresses for VMM, or reserved addresses if I'm using DHCP reservations. These will be indeed static addresses using that automatic utilization calculation. Okay, so I don't want to change it here. I can, if I want, enable network virtualization on this range. Now, if this range happens to be hooked up into VMM and our VMM environment is enabled with network virtualization, then I can make use of that here. Now, if you're not familiar with network virtualization and all the differences between customer spaces and provider spaces, don't sweat it, because VMM by itself is pretty complex with its network, how it deals with networks. And when you start adding in network virtualization, the complexity of VMM just goes through the roof. So don't sweat it for now if you're unfamiliar with what network virtualization is. And for our purposes here, we're going to leave it disabled in every case. This is most commonly associated if you're a service provider and needing to create special ranges for individual clients out of the address space that you have. I can add in custom configurations if I want, a variety of different fields that I can add here into my database with the associated values. I can set what any defined configurations should be, and then I need to plug in the common stuff that's associated with an IP address range. My DNS servers, 192.168.1.200, any suffix search order things that I need to add in here, like company.pri, WINS servers, the gateway server here, and the metric, so 192.168.1.0, oops, not 10, 1.0, with a metric of automatic. And then down here, if I have any reservations or any virtual IP addresses. Our virtual IP addresses here are associated again when I'm connecting this thing up with Virtual Machine Manager. VIPs are most commonly associated in Virtual Machine Manager with network load balancing logical addresses. So let me hit OK here, and that will create the second range from now 151 through 254. So I got two different ranges. The next step in the process is to actually get the IP addresses out of my spreadsheet and into a form that we can import them into this IPAM database. And there's a couple different ways in which you can accomplish that. There's the manual way, and then there is the spreadsheet way. And I want to show you both of them because they're both really handy to understand. Let's go about first by adding an IP address to this database, a single IP address that's associated with our server DEN-DC1. Now this is the long form way. This is going through all the steps of configuring each individual parameter for its entry into the database. So I'm going to have to punch these in one by one. So 192.168.1.200 is the server name. It's managed by IPAM. The local host instance, it is a host as opposed to one of the whole bunch of different items that is here. The address state is currently in use, and it's a statically assigned address. And the client ID here will be oops, that's not what I need. This is for DHCP reservation. If I want to keep these identified in DHCP as reservations, I can accomplish that as well. And let's see here. For DNS records, I need to set the device name, which will be den-dc1.company.pri. Company.pri. I can set the forward lookup zone to company.pri with DEN-DC1 as the primary server. And there's my reverse lookup zone. And I can create DNS records if I need to for this IP address. There we go. And then any custom configurations and any defined configurations as before. Running through this process, we'll go through, as you can see, creating the address in IPAM and then going through the effort there in DNS to update the record. If I had configured a DHCP reservation, I could accomplish that as well. Now, I think if I go here to IP addresses, I'll find this single address. There it is. There is my address, 192.168.1.200. There is my device name of DEN-DC1. And I've got all the nifty things that I've added in here when I created the address. Now, you may be saying, okay, well, I thought this was supposed to be automatic. And it is, because in a minute I'm going to show you where we start to get into the really awesome parts of this. But I still have to go through the process of migrating my addresses in for this database to really understand what I've got out there in the environment from a static perspective. Doing that for each individual address that I have is just a pain in the neck. So it's perhaps easier for me to import in a series of IP addresses. That import can happen via a comma-separated values file that I've created with each of the comma-separated values being equal to the parameters that have been defined here, these columns in the database. Now I've already gone through and created a comma-separated values file here with some, really the most important, the required items that need to happen for these addresses to get imported in. The address itself, who it's managed by, IPAM in every case, the instance, which is localhost, the device type, whether it's in use, the fact that it's static, and then the device name here. This little comma-separated values file is something that you can literally export out of your existing spreadsheet so that you can import it into IPAM and very quickly spin yourself up on the things you need to do, or spin yourself up on getting these addresses migrated into the database. If I go here to tasks and import IP addresses, point to my CSV file, bam, those 4 addresses get imported in. And as you can see here, I've got a little bit of extra work to get a couple of these things plugged into their proper location so that they're properly recognized here in the IPAM database. In the case of this host, we haven't created a range, we haven't created a block for 192.168.2, and we haven't created another block there for 192.168.3. Depending on how you wanted to set this up, you could create a block for 192.168 and then create ranges for the 2net and the 3net. It's kind of really up to you how you want to end up dividing out the different addresses that you have. Now, once you have these things hooked up into your IPAM database, this is when we really start to get to the interesting part of IPAM. And that's actually defining which addresses are now available for use. So let's assume then that we have an IP address range here. And now we'll play the role of my old friend Gary as you and I walk into his office to ask for a new IP address. Hello, Gary, I'm walking in because I got a new server I've got to build. Well, when I'm walking in, Gary's going to say, you know what? No problem. Let me go ahead and find and allocate an available IP address for you. Now, this process is going to go through and identify which of the next addresses are available in the range that I'm looking for, right? So in this 1net, what's the next address available for me? That address, because we know which addresses have been plugged into the IPAM database, is going to be 1.151. So then what IPAM does is it goes about pinging that address and then checking for any existing DNS records just in case that server happens to be turned off, so that we can better ensure that the address being handed out is one that is actually valid and not being used by perhaps a temporarily powered off server. Once we've done that, then we can come down and identify the usual information here that's associated with the IP address itself, the MAC address, the service, the expiry date, the asset tag, the stuff that Gary would put in his database anyway. So really kind of a cool way for someone in your organization to keep track of the IP addresses and to keep a nice just inventory of the assets that you have by IP address itself. You can further, from time to time, come back in and reclaim any IP addresses that haven't been used for a period of time. You can use this tool to help you identify which ones have not been used so that you don't end up removing them from the database before their time. It's even possible for you to enter in expiry dates for individual addresses, so that if you know you're going to be using an address for a specific period of time, then you can define what the end date is going to be for that address, the beginning date and the end date, so that you'll get a notification it's time to remove this address from the database because the server no longer exists. I wish all of us had the wherewithal to be able to have a known entry date or exit date for a server, but if you're one of those people that knows you're just going to have a server for a couple of weeks at most, this is a great way to ensure that you don't have to go all the way down to Gary's desk in order to let him know you're not using that IP address anymore. The connections we laid in place also between IPAM and the other network servers out there like DNS and DHCP also expose other automations as well. Now you can see down here that if we take a look at our DNS and DHCP servers down here, once we have IPAM kind of layered over the top of these servers, we can use IPAM as the mechanism to accomplish a variety of tasks in DHCP. We can do things also in DNS. We already took a look at some of the registration we can do in DNS. Now, here there's only the ability to launch the DNS MMC, but when we were creating those records, recall that we had the ability to automatically create all the registrations that were necessary in DNS. We're seeing our DHCP scopes down here. The scopes are the ones that are discovered directly from those connections. I can see information about the health of my DNS zones. Oh no, I've got a problem here with one of my DNS zones. Well, maybe I should scroll down and figure out why those problems are existing. There's no data for one of the servers. I have an error with one of the zones here, one of the Active Directory integrated primary zones. And then also down here in the event catalog, I have a nice collection of all the actions that have been accomplished through that IPAM console. Now, the whole point of this solution really is to give you the ability to take a step beyond my old friend Gary and having his little spreadsheet that only he could access. IPAM provides a mechanism for you to create this nice view that anyone with access to Server Manager and the right access control, the right permissions, can go about managing their addresses or their address spaces while everyone works with that single database. Now, one of the neat things about this is the ability to distribute out some of the roles between who gets to control the major constructs of IPAM, like creating blocks and creating ranges, and then who has the abilities to work with individual address records. So I need to create an address record. I need to query an address record. Back in the old days, the only way for us to be able to get a new IP address was to march on down and to have Gary added into his spreadsheet one person at a time. And if Gary wasn't around, well, it's going to take a little while for us to get access to that database. By giving someone the ability to access a specific IP address record or to change individual IP address records, well, then we have the abilities to get those machines built and the tickets completed much faster than waiting around for Gary to get back from lunch. As with any role-based access control solution, I can set what the roles are. I can define what the scopes will be for those roles. So do I want to set it to the global scope, or do I want to create additional scopes and divide out the different addresses, address ranges, or blocks by different scopes, and then define what the policies will be, which are essentially the combination of the role, the scope, and the individual user or group that should have access to complete those tasks. The only last little bit we have that I want to show you in here, and it's one I kind of glossed over it for a second, but it's something that's kind of cool, is this ability to kind of take these addresses and create tags with them. And they're not called tags here. They're called address range groups right here. But these address range groups are essentially another kind of layer, a virtual layer that sits on top of the addresses. They give you the ability to add your own discrete descriptors for ranges or addresses. So let's say, for example, in IPv4, I'm managed by a particular service, but I also would then want to go for the addresses that are in the building number 2 on the 2nd floor, or the addresses that are associated to the developers that happen to be in a certain project. Whatever your need is to distribute these different addresses out, you can accomplish by setting them here by setting the categories here for these address range groups. And I think we actually looked at these already. The ability to add address range groups is right here, where you'll identify what the address range group, and then identify then what the built-in and custom fields you'll want to use for grouping those addresses. Those ranges are identified back here under IPAM settings, here under custom fields, and then the associations between those custom fields. So if you feel like you want to tag those addresses, if you've got a bunch of them, you want to figure out exactly where they're at, you can accomplish that as well. I have just a couple of quick PowerShell commands I want to show you, and then also one really important feature that was kind of left out of the mainline distribution of IPAM here in 2012 R2. We'll start first with a specific feature that you might be thinking, well, gosh, it seems to be a little bit missing from the list of addresses that we're looking at here. And that is not just the DHCP lease information, but the actual DHCP leases. If you see back here when we're taking a look at our IP address blocks and the ranges that we have, we indeed have gathered a list of ranges from our DHCP server here from 100 to 150. We don't actually have any IP addresses that are coming out of DHCP. That is because actually gathering that information out of DHCP is a feature that was not built directly into IPAM and was added afterwards. This may or may not be something that exists on the exam because it's not something that is completely, I guess I'll say completely supported by Microsoft, even though this feature is going to be available on Microsoft's website. But it's something you might want to add because it's nice to be able to see not only your static addresses and your VMM addresses, but also those DHCP addresses as well. Let me show you the little hack here. So the website that you want to go to in order to be able to do this is, I'm going here to TechNet and a website here called Managing IP Address Space. So this is one of the sites here that are associated with the IPAM Administrator's Guide. And down here at the bottom is the process you will go through for adding in that DHCP lease data from the network. Now, the reason why I say that this is something that is perhaps only marginally supported by Microsoft is because the process to accomplish this requires a script that you get from the Microsoft Script Center. So here under gallery.technet is this Script Center script, this integration module that you're going to need to download and then invoke in order to begin that process of gathering information from DHCP. This is something that, again, it's not entirely part of IPAM, but it's an add-on feature that you can incorporate if you feel the need to do so. the script that comes down is not signed. And so in order to execute the script, you'll either need to sign the script or you'll need to set your execution policy to bypass for just long enough to run the script. Your security policy will dictate which of those you need to accomplish. That script is IPAM integration _ DHCP.ps1. What that will do is make the invoke IPAM DHCP lease commandlet available in that PowerShell session. So it's going to load it's going to instantiate and load a module. And then from there, give you the ability to execute this command, invoke IPAM DHCP lease, and then the following parameters. Now here's the catch. Doing this will interrogate the DHCP database for its leases that it's handed out one time. And so the way in which you invoke this is to actually set it up as a scheduled task. Now you can use the --periodic switch in order to get it to run for 24 hours every 6 hours. But the real way, if you want to get this to work permanently, is to literally go to the task scheduler library on your IPAM server, locate what will now be the IPAM DHCP integration task after you've run this command line or this commandlet, and then configure the task and run it however often you want it to run. A bit of a hack, right, admittedly, but at least this gives you the ability to import in that DHCP information. Make sure you set up everything so you've got it in the right ranges and whatnot, but if you feel like you want that DHCP information, these are the commands and the mechanisms that you'll make use of those commands there inside of PowerShell. Now lastly are a couple of PowerShell commands too that you probably should just be aware of for the exam. And you might need it if you end up having to upscale your database off of that Windows internal database. The first is move IPAM database. And the move IPAM database, if I show you some of the examples of it, of course there are none. If I show you the move IPAM database command, what this essentially does is it points, you execute this on your IPAM server and point it at the SQL server where you have already created a SQL database, and it will go about copying the contents of the database, creating all the table structures that are necessary, and then creating that database over on your SQL server. Okay? There's a lot more here because you got to go about creating that database, but recognize that this is a command that is one of those that just seems like one you would see on the test because there is that migrate objective that's there on the exam as well. The other thing I would be aware of is any of the actual IPAM commands, the PowerShell commands that exist out there in the wild. So where name like IPAM. This list of commands right here, anything involving the module name IPAM server, something you might want to be aware of because these PowerShell commandlets are just things that people like to test on. And being able to manipulate IPAM through PowerShell is a particularly useful function, in part or mainly because one of the biggest benefits of IPAM is this ability to create a kind of API for any of the other types of actions that you might be creating, coding out in the world. So I talked about VMM, for example, right? And how VMM up here has the ability to talk to IPAM in order to get the data, the IP addresses that it requires out of the address ranges that you've set up. But there's nothing that says you can't create your own custom activities, whether it be through PowerShell directly or through Orchestrator, to provision machines, to request IP addresses, to receive IP addresses, to release them, and so on and so on and so on. So having this and having this entire list of commands at your disposal makes the whole process of automating this entire experience that much easier as you begin to go through the process of creating automations associated with provisioning new servers. So what have we talked about in this nugget? In this nugget, we've talked about provisioning IPAM, both through group policy and through that somewhat nightmarish manual process. Talked about the storage, either the Windows internal database or our SQL Server storage, the discovery process, and the creation and management of the blocks, and then the ranges within those blocks. Took a look at how we can monitor and customize the monitoring of that IP address space, that all-important migrate command, and then also the delegation and management tasks associated with keeping our little spreadsheet all that much more exciting. Coming up next, there'll be a topic entitled Configure and Optimize Storage. which is kind of I don't know, it's waving your hands in the air to speak to a couple of very important topics that relate to iSCSI. In that nugget, we'll configure some iSCSI targets and initiators. We'll talk about iStore, the Internet Storage Name Server, ISNS. We'll even talk about tiered storage and how to manage that server free space using those features on demand. I think it'll be an interesting topic. If you're using iSCSI, this is going to be an interesting one for helping you get those configurations correct. That's the topic for our next nugget. So until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.